when I envisioned this talk, I envisioned it naturally in person. And so translated to the Zoom format. I also envisioned that we would be together with all of our filmmakers, but because it was half hour and Zoom, I had to make this hard choice. And mothers hate to make that choice, you know, all of our, because it really feels like a conception, this film program. And the reason I chose both of you guys today, it wasn't just like the kind of synergies I felt when I watched your films back to back again, but it was also because I've had the longest engagement with both of you in terms of having, you know, written and spent time with your work before. Tirza, it was earlier this year when I met you at the Berlinale Forum, and you had your solo show, Endy and Survival Trilogy. Mm-hmm. And it was really so moving to spend time with your work because it was installed and there for, you know, some time. And I wrote about it for Berlin Art Link. And Jessica, I also remember, it's been a while now, I wrote about your very first Black in Berlin, this amazing sort of discursive format that you created here in Germany. And the very first session, do you remember? Of course. We're going to talk about memory today, though. Yes. It was 2013, and it was in this now defunct bookstore, such an important space. I remember
defunct bookstore, Dialogue Books, which is now an imprint of Little Brown, Hatchet, UK. So it's like, I mean, it just, these spaces, they just grow and transform and transmute, and it's so beautiful to see.
That is such a good story. I'm so happy that you shared that here, because I was thinking what happened to that space, and now I know that it's a publishing house. That's amazing.
Yeah.
And I wrote about it for the Mic Movement, online platform created by Denise Van de Cruz. So I was really thinking, okay, you know, I've had, you know, spent time with Jessica, it's been quite a few years, and with Tirza, just I felt when I saw your films and spent time with them, I just felt like, this is really sort of moving something in me, kind of like the Lego, you know. But I wanted to definitely talk about, you know, what I felt when I sort of engaged with your films together, and it's so exciting how, in very different ways, because, you know, yours is you're doing a kind of road movie through time and kind of space, and in a way we stay in one space, Jessica, in your film, but we also move, you know, transnationally. But you also talk about families, and I was really interested in how would you both describe your films, or better yet, tell me how your grandmothers would describe your films. So what would they be saying to their friends about their granddaughters' moving image works?
Oh my goodness. I think when my grandmother saw the film, she talked a lot about forgotten stories. And forgotten histories. I think she used the phrase forgotten or left out or left behind. And I mean, the way I describe it is an archive. But that's not what she said, but I felt like it rang true within her that it was an archive, because she noted that it was important to tell these stories, that they wouldn't have been communicated otherwise, that these aren't stories that are written down in your typical history books. These are, you know, these are stories that are oral traditions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think my grandma, she was really self-conscious when she saw the film. Like she had, like, when she was alive, she didn't like looking at herself in the mirror because she was old. She had like this really strange relationship to her image. But something I think she and I noticed in the film was like how women's stories aren't really told through history. Like I followed her and her mother and her mother's mother, but like when I talked to the part of the film with my grandpa, like he talked about, you know, like his dad and his grandfather, but you know, like my grandpa didn't really tell me anything growing up about like the women in that side of the family. So I found it interesting how that operated in the film.
Mm. Well, that's really interesting what you're saying, because I think, you know, that kind of way of positioning a narrative, I think that it's interesting because then what's learned through that is that some people are active in the family and some are passive and some are kinetic and some are not. Um, did you feel it, Jessica, when you were then speaking specifically to women and femmes about, you know, their stories? Did you also find something was sort of moving in people in the middle of telling in the middle of their interviews? Because it's something that I noticed. There were always these moments, the way people moved, that it felt as if, you know, connections were being made in the moment of the interview.
Definitely. I mean, there were a lot of revelations discovered for the interviewees, for the subjects, and I mean, we had to take a lot of breaks because there were a lot of difficult moments. And when you're doing this kind of interview style, documentary style filmmaking, you know, it's difficult because you also have these breaks where it's like, oh, if you're outside filming, where it's like, oh, wait, no, a plane just went by. Could you say that terrible, tragic thing again, please, for the fourth time? But actually, there was some power in that as well, because they kind of took ownership of it when they said it the second time or the third time or the fourth time. And it really sunk into them. And for a lot of them, it was things that they had thought about, or, you know, ideas that you have that you store deep within yourself, but maybe you're too afraid or afraid of speaking them out loud because the truth could hurt other people. And that happened during the process. Actually, there were some family members of some of the participants who weren't happy with their truth telling.
Wow. I want to ask you about that, Thirza, because there's certain people in the story and certain people who are not in the story. What did other family members feel about this journey that you took to the homeland of both your grandmother and your grandfather?
It's interesting. I mean, like when I made the film, like the rest of my family wasn't very interested in it. But then my grandma died, and then later my grandpa died, and and I wanted my family to be able to see it whenever they wanted. So I put it on. I think I put it on Vimeo for them, and they were telling me about watching it and just like how comforting it was to like have, you know, these stories from these people, because, you know, like when I made the video, I knew my grandma and grandpa weren't going to be around forever, and there's still stories I wish my grandpa had told me that I know I'm just not going to hear now. Yeah. What was the original question? Like sort of.
Just about other family members who didn't make it to the film. You know, your mom's in the film and others. So just how did they also, you know, react to it? I'm sure for them it was also learning new things, or maybe hearing stories that they've heard before in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's things that they didn't hear before. Like I have some cousins who never were told the story of like my family's involvement in sort of the 1885 rebellion. So, you know, like they just didn't hear those stories before, which is surprising because my grandpa talked about that all the time. He was like so proud of his grandfather for being involved. But yeah.
That was one thing I really enjoyed about both of your films, was that, you know, that these sort of plans and tactics for sort of repair, restitution were transmitted through oral histories. And then there was also this kind of meta level where you guys, you know, for Jessica, in your film Muta Erde, how the protagonist, the people that you were talking to, kind of went to the next meta level, talking about stories, you know. Mm-hmm. And also Thirza, I felt like, you know, with your characteristic really wry wit, you would kind of then sort of riff off of, in a way, the way that stories are told and transmitted. So I just wanted to talk about that. Was that something that happened in the process of making the film, or were you consciously actually also talking to, the people in your film about storytelling so that they were aware that they're storytelling about storytelling?
Yeah, I mean, my grandpa was like a traditional storyteller. Like he got, like all those indigenous stories from like these Cree stories from like the past that he had been told by like his family members and but my grandma was like not that much of a storyteller. And there was actually this story she told us. There were some stories they told us after this film was made that were really interesting. Like my grandma talked about one time she was pushed up a grade and she wasn't ready yet. She wasn't mature enough, so she was sort of like kicked out of school and sent to work in a fish plant, and she didn't like it, so she like did a really bad job, so they would fire her basically. But yeah, like grandma didn't really open up for stories like that very often, so like making this film with her was kind of like one of the only times I got to really hear about her growing up and her relationship to these family members who I'd never met. Like there's this whole white side of my family that I never met over in New Brunswick, and my mom's met them, but I don't know them. So yeah.
I don't think I communicated the aspect of storytelling to them because the film made itself. So the idea was never a film. It was supposed to be individual portraits of these femmes, just speaking loosely around the topic of their matriarchal lineage. And the reason that it became a film is because the stories were so linked and so intertwined, and it was just remarkable. These people from 5 different countries, 3 different continents, 4 different continents, that they would have such similar stories. And that's been the one thing that's really stuck with the feedback from audience members, or people coming to me, young Afro-Europeans coming to me and saying, I showed this film to my grandmother, I showed it to my mom, and we reconnected in a new and different way because there were things said in the film by other people that they felt themselves or they had been wanting to say, but they didn't know how to communicate it. I think that's been happening a lot for me lately with different tweets I see, and it's like, that's exactly what I wanted to say, but I didn't know how to say it. But that's something really incredible about African diasporic history and femme history and indigenous history, is that these stories often repeat, or you have this similar stories in family history. I remember this moment from your film, Tirsa, when your grandfather was talking about the Mongols. And yeah, he just talks about how you can identify that and them. And it just was so interesting to me because my great grandfather used to say something about that. I remember him saying something about that, but I never understood what he was talking about. And I think some of the other family members didn't understand what he was talking about because we were like, Mongolian, that we're not connected to them. What are you saying? Yeah, so I think that's, I don't know if I really answered the question about storytelling, but it made me think about it.
No, but I think it's also so interesting that the importance of stories that we don't even understand, how you still remember them, and maybe you don't know exactly why you're being told this story, but something else is transmitted. Maybe it's just the place where the story was told, the way the story is told. Also, there's in your case of the language the story was told. I thought that was such a moving point when we go in and out. Your grandfather translates himself. Maybe you could tell us a bit about that as well. The importance of having the story told twice and recorded twice.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's just like any sort of like indigenous person in North America who's like trying to learn their language again. Like my grandpa was a fluent speaker, but sort of this tragedy in our family was that he I mean, he grew up in like a day school, which is like kind of like residential school, except he got to go home at night. But he sort of had this idea that you wouldn't teach your children your indigenous language because it would hold them back from like advancing in sort of this like white Western colonized society. So my mom and her siblings didn't know Plains Cree, and so my grandpa was like the last fluent speaker in our family that had it. So it's been like sort of this struggle trying to learn that language again. And I've been taking classes on and off throughout my life and like learning and trying to write it down. And yeah, it's been so having him say it in Plains Cree and then translate, it's kind of like having sort of, like you don't often hear that language out in the world. You have to really seek it out. Yeah, so I think in a way it was kind of like just something so that I could like listen to it later and try to like figure out the different words and what they mean. Yeah.
I really love that part of sorry to cut you off. I really love that part of the film because it's quite early, and for a while I thought I had dropped into the wrong room, the wrong film. I was like, wait, no, I don't understand, and there's no captions, and what's happening? I'm in the wrong place. But it was a really interesting moment as an audience member because it makes you question yourself and also realize your privilege of like, wait, actually, this can be in a language that I don't understand, and it could be translated or not, and I can feel and listen to the way the words sound and move.
Yeah. So I'm like still trying to like reincorporate like Plains Cree into like my filmmaking, but it's it's a steep learning curve. Like there's long words that have like a whole bunch of syllables and stuff. So, yeah.
Yeah, and it's funny because I mean, I said translated, but that was maybe presumptuous of me. At some point, I was also thinking like maybe it's a totally different thing, in English and in Cree. And I love that idea of this kind of opacity, I think, just what you mentioned about that moment of sort of checking yourself and realizing, oh, actually, feeling that I need to always feel welcome in a room, and maybe also taking a step back and having something that's not for me, but having the privilege of being, invited into the room. It felt, it was a really, really important moment for me in understanding the story. It was a really important moment at the beginning to say, okay, I'm going to choose some, and but there's a lot that you're not seeing, and I loved that. Yeah. So I titled this film program Camera Memory for Human Forgetfulness. And this is a quote from Trinh T. Minh Ha's film, Forgetting Vietnam. And I'll just take a moment right now to mention the other filmmakers in the program: Le Mo Hang, Jeremiah Muzese, Nengo Muki, Krista Zhu, Juan D'Angelo, and Wendelin Van Oldenburg. Please, everybody who's watching live, check out the rest of the films. Take your time. We have another week. Things are online. And I hope you guys also enjoy the sort of synergies in between them. But thinking about this idea of camera memory, now that we're speaking also about language, I think what you said there's about, that it was the fact that it was recorded is really important to a type of learning, for language. And I was really thinking, in terms of, and to go back, Trinh T. Minh Ha, the entire quote is, camera memory for human forgetfulness, or is it the other way around? And so I wanted to think about the other way around, which would be, I guess, human memory for camera forgetfulness. Also, I guess, could be a title for a future film program. But this idea of maybe, human memory for camera forgetfulness. And I'm wondering about things that are not recorded. And maybe what you wish was recorded but is not, or things that you've consciously, and not just in your filmmaking practice, but outside, things you've consciously not recorded because you wanted to keep that human memory intact.
I think, I mean, it reminds me of the quote from Toby in the film when she says, when an elder dies, a whole library burns. And some of the participants, when I asked them some questions, they declined. It wasn't like they put their everything out. Because I asked specifically about rituals. I was very interested in that from, grandparents or ancestors, what rituals there were. And there were some participants who said, no, it's not appropriate to say those rituals, to state them in words on camera. And I hadn't thought about that. I don't have the privilege of knowing past my grandparents, beside my one great grandfather, and or knowing their ancestral traditions or rituals or histories or anything like that. So I yearn for it. I think that was one of the inspirations for the film as well. Just collecting these stories to kind of fill this void. Which speaks to a lot of the African-American experience. So it surprised me, but it also humbled me to know that there are some things that shouldn't be written down and aren't written down for a reason, or documented in the way that we, in a Western idea, document them.
Yeah, I kind of had the same feelings about like ceremonies. Like there's medicine people in my family, and I was just kind of raised with this sense that you don't like take pictures or like record video in a ceremony. I mean, I know there's different people who have different ideas around that, and like I'm not saying it's like any good or bad way to go about it, but like personally, I don't film or record in ceremonies. And also when my grandparents were dying, like it was a really spiritual time to be around them and to be caring for them in that like really vulnerable end of life state. And I never took pictures of them when that was going on. I wrote about it online, but actually one of my uncles was like, I don't want you writing about that online. So I like sort of privately wrote about it online. It was interesting, like sort of the sense of like family privacy around those events in someone's life.
Yeah. When you spoke about rituals, thinking about new rituals, and there's your desire to sort of go to these sort of homelands. And I was trying to think about, what rituals I had when I went back to Guyana in the Caribbean to see where my family, we say we're from Guyana because the first place that we know we're from. I mean, Barbados before that, and then before that, the Bill of Sale. So these ideas of rituals connected to land. And then for me, it was so interesting, Jessica, how your film is in a garden. So we travel through time and space with the different photographs and stories, but we're situated in the garden. And I wanted to talk to you about that decision, the garden. Why was that an important sort of location for you, and what was you trying to transmit through that space where everybody met?
Well, I mean, it came initially from one of the only pieces of information that I know about my mother's mother, who I never met. There hasn't been in my family history that we know of a granddaughter who has met their grandmother on their mother's side. My child hasn't met my mother. She passed, and then I haven't met my grandmother, and my mom never met her grandmother. And so one of the only things that I knew about her, she was very private, very secretive, is what my mother told me. But I know that she loved to garden, and my mom got her the green thumb from her, and I got my green thumb from my mom. And so when I was in residency at District Kunst und Kulturförderung, where I made the film, there was this tiny little plot of land that was just completely abandoned. And I just knew I wanted to get in there and do something. So I planted this huge garden, and it felt like the perfect place. And then at the time I was also reading Alice Walker and her essays and In My Mother's Garden. And it felt right.
Yeah, to me, this was really, moving, this idea of what a garden could mean for a diaspora, in terms of, and how a garden can also be an archive, going back to what you were saying earlier about stories being archives, and thinking again, about my family, when you have a place that has existed in your family for a while, these stories like, okay, your aunt planted that prickly thyme leaf plant and your uncle planted that tree over there. So I wonder if there's, or also Jessica, you could speak about, some of the stories around land and connection to land, and how that plays a role also in the telling. I mean, we were speaking earlier about how it's important where the story is told, but for me, it was just so interesting. There's in your film, as you were traveling, the way the storytelling, it always was connected to place. Yeah.
Yes. Well, I mean, again, as an African American, my the history of land is so violent, and often displaced, or often feeling displaced. Losing land a lot of times. I mean, I have countless stories of family members, uncles and cousins, aunties who had land and lost it through, some racist bylaws and tax, tax laws and things like that. And so land ownership was something growing up that was a really prideful thing, and it was really important to have land, and to take care of the land and to respect the land, and so I think that all of the participants in the field in the film, they also had a very strong connection, even if they were more transient, because some of them moved around a lot, but a very strong connection to the landscape, the particular landscape and smells of where they come from.
Yeah, in my film, one of my grandpas talking about like his territory that his family traveled on, like he would talk about things like there was a waterfall somewhere in the States that they would like go behind, and there's like a cave behind it. And I would love to find out which waterfall it was, but like we didn't know. And there's also this story about like how my great grandfather fled from the army by going down into the States and joining like a Wild West show and traveling around until it was like kind of like a cheap Wild West show, I guess, because it kind of like fell apart and they let everybody go. And then having to like go on one of those, I guess it's like some kind of trolley to like go like on the railway to go like back to the state to Canada. And then my grandma told this story about her mother being afraid when the children her grandmother being afraid when the children would cross this bridge in Scotland. And when we went to see this town that my great grandmother grew up in, it was like this bridge was kind of like a drawbridge, so it's like that's why she was afraid, because it would like open and close. Yeah, so it was interesting tying like family history to like actual locations.
Place memory. Memory. It's very visceral.
That and this sort of visceralness which you speak about, you can really feel it in the film. I described both of your films as tender and tactile, because there's something about it where you just kind of, I don't know, you feel it in a special way. So we started with grandmothers, and we have 5 minutes left. I think this is our last question. So, and we started with self-care. So I'm going to put those two questions together for our final question. I want to know And I'll open it up to not just mothers, but grandmothers and grandfathers. What did your mothers, your grandmothers, your grandfathers teach you about self-care?
I think my grandma liked to bake a lot. Like it wasn't just like care for herself, but it was also like care for the family. Like she was like so into cooking and baking, and I've noticed that's something I've like gravitated towards during this quarantine is I'm like cooking and baking a lot, and, like sort of like nourishing myself. And like I'm the only one here, but I'm like still trying to like like have something nice to eat, so I'm not like so depressed that I'm stuck inside. Yeah, I think that's what my grandma taught me.
Something that my mother and my grandmother on my father's side definitely taught me. It's just constantly giving to people, checking in on people, thanking people. I didn't realize that this wasn't a social norm until I moved out of the house. I was like, oh, everyone doesn't just send thank you notes for everything or, go over and check on people or drop things off at their doorstep or I think some of it I've had to unlearn in that my mother and grandmother gave too much of themselves. And that's, of course, a lot of the labor that Black femmes do. So some of it I've had to unlearn, but at the pure heart of it is that giving spirit.
Well, on that note, I can only say thank you for what you've given us today. This has been such an amazing connection. I really want to just say this is the beginning. I want so much for us all to meet in the not too distant future. And I would love for you to keep making films so that we can put them together again. There's something really special happening between your works. So I'm really so thankful that I've been able to experience them together in this program. So Jessica Lauren Elizabeth Taylor, filmmaker, activist, wonderful, amazing mother in Berlin. Thirza Catt-Hand, amazing filmmaker, wonderful person who I'm so excited to get to know in Toronto, but your background tells us so much more. I have to say, I'm really curious if anything that we said today was brought up by your psychic. Are there connections being made
No.
right now?
No, my psychic mostly talked about relationships and me.
Oh, well, next time I hope I make it into your psychic reading.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.
So much. Take care. God bless.
Take care of yourself.